The diamond ring lay in a puddle, worth more than she'd earn in 10 lifetimes. Lee Soo-jin almost stepped on it during her pre-dawn walk to the subway station, the streetlights of Seoul's Gangnam district catching its facets and sending tiny rainbows across the wet pavement. For 3 frozen seconds, she stared at the platinum band embedded with stones that looked impossibly perfect, her heart hammering against her ribs with a force that made her dizzy. Her first instinct was to look around, to see if someone was watching, if this was some kind of elaborate test or hidden camera prank. The street remained empty except for a stray cat picking through garbage near a closed cafe. Just her, the ring, and a choice that would reshape everything. Soo-jin's fingers trembled as she picked up the ring, its weight substantial and cold against her palm. She'd cleaned enough luxury apartments in her 3 years as a housekeeping contractor to recognize authentic wealth when she saw it. This wasn't costume jewelry or a clever fake. This was the kind of ring that came in velvet boxes from stores she'd never dare enter. The kind that represented someone's most important promises and dreams. Someone, somewhere, was probably devastated by its loss. The sensible choice crystallized immediately in her mind. She should take it to the nearest police station, file a report, and let the authorities handle reuniting the ring with its owner. That's what honest people did. That's what her mother had taught her before cancer had stolen her voice and left Soo-jin drowning in medical debt that would take decades to repay. The right choice was obvious, simple, completely at odds with the desperate calculations her survival instincts were already making, because Soo-jin knew exactly what this ring could mean for her life. She could sell it, discreetly, through channels she'd heard other struggling workers whisper about in break rooms. The money would clear her mother's remaining hospital bills. It would pay for her younger sister's high school tuition, sparing Jiwoo from the part-time jobs that were already affecting her grades. It might even leave enough for Soo-jin to finally register for the university entrance exam she'd postponed 4 times, chasing a dream that seemed more impossible with each passing year. Seoul's morning commute began stirring around her. Business people in expensive suits emerging from luxury apartments, delivery trucks rumbling past, the city's relentless machinery grinding back to life. Soo-jin slipped the ring into her pocket and continued toward the subway. Her decision temporarily suspended, the weight of temptation and conscience warring inside her chest. She told herself she was just keeping it safe, that she'd figure out the right thing to do after her shift. But the truth was messier, more human. She was terrified of doing the right thing, because the right thing had never once rewarded her sacrifice. Her morning cleaning route took her through Choi Industries' executive floors, 20 stories above street level where Seoul's elite conducted business in glass-walled offices with views that cost more than most people's homes. Soo-jin moved through these spaces like a ghost, invisible to the executives who never looked at cleaning staff, her existence acknowledged only when something wasn't perfectly spotless. She'd learned to appreciate this invisibility. It meant less harassment, fewer uncomfortable encounters, the freedom to exist in wealthy spaces without being questioned. The executive washroom was where she overheard the conversation that changed everything. 2 men in expensive suits, washing their hands, discussing their boss's personal crisis with the casual cruelty of people who'd never experienced real consequences. Kang Do-hyun, CEO of Choi Industries' technology division, had lost his mother's engagement ring, a family heirloom worth over 2 billion won, irreplaceable for sentimental reasons that transcended its already staggering monetary value. The ring had disappeared somewhere between his car and his apartment the previous evening during Seoul's sudden rainstorm. Do-hyun had retraced his steps a dozen times, hired a private investigation firm, and was offering a substantial reward for its return. Soo-jin's hand moved unconsciously to her pocket, where the ring sat like a burning coal against her thigh. The universe had just handed her a clear path forward. Return the ring, claim the reward, solve her problems without the moral stain of theft. But something held her paralyzed in the supply closet where she'd retreated to process this information. The men's conversation had revealed something else. Do-hyun was engaged to Yoon Mi-rae, daughter of Yoon Industries' chairman, a merger of dynasties that would reshape Korea's business landscape. The ring wasn't just valuable. It was the centerpiece of an arrangement that affected thousands of employees, stock prices, entire economic sectors. She could use this information differently. The thought arrived unwelcome but persistent, whispering possibilities she desperately didn't want to consider. She could approach Do-hyun privately, return the ring, and leverage his gratitude into something more than a simple reward. A permanent job with benefits. A recommendation that would open doors her background had kept locked. People did this all the time in Seoul's cutthroat hierarchy. They accumulated leverage and used it strategically. Why should she be different? Why should her honesty be absolute when the world had never been honest with her? The moral gymnastics exhausted her, and Soo-jin made an impulsive decision, born from frustration and the bone-deep weariness of years spent choosing ethics over survival. She would return the ring directly to Do-hyun, face to face, and simply be honest about where she'd found it. No games, no leverage, no calculations. Just one human being returning another human being's lost possession because it was the right thing to do, even if the right thing had never once repaid her decency. Getting access to Do-hyun proved harder than she'd anticipated. His secretary rejected her 3 times, each refusal more condescending than the last. Security almost escorted her from the building when she insisted on waiting in the lobby. The class barriers that usually remained invisible became brutally apparent when she tried to cross them. To these gatekeepers, a cleaning woman claiming to have important business with the CEO was either delusional or running some kind of scam. Their contempt was casual, automatic, the kind of cruelty that people in power inflict without even recognizing it as violence. Soo-jin finally caught Do-hyun by accident in the parking garage during her evening shift, her last chance before giving up and taking the ring to the police, as she should have done 16 hours earlier. He was alone for once, his security detail temporarily absent, looking exhausted and disheveled in ways that expensive suits couldn't quite hide. When she called out to him, he turned with an expression mixing hope and suspicion, the look of someone who'd been disappointed too many times to trust easily. She held out the ring without preamble, watching his face cycle through disbelief, relief, and something more complex she couldn't quite identify. Do-hyun stared at the platinum band like he was seeing a ghost, his hand shaking slightly as he took it from her palm. He asked where she'd found it, and Soo-jin explained simply, honestly, leaving out her hours of temptation and moral struggle. Just the facts. She'd found it in a puddle near his building, recognized it might be important, and wanted to return it to its owner. Do-hyun's response wasn't what she expected. Instead of immediate gratitude, he studied her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable, his eyes searching her face like he was trying to solve a complicated equation. He asked why she'd waited an entire day to return it, why she hadn't just left it with security or taken it to the police. The questions felt like accusations, and Soo-jin felt her temper flare, the unfairness of being interrogated for doing the right thing finally breaking through her carefully maintained composure. She explained about the overheard conversation, about wanting to return the ring directly, about the barriers she'd faced trying to access someone of his status. Then, because exhaustion and frustration had eroded her usual filters, she admitted the truth. She'd been tempted. She'd held that ring and calculated exactly how it could transform her struggling existence. She'd imagined selling it, using it as leverage, all the morally compromised options that desperation whispers. But in the end, she'd chosen honesty because that's what her mother had taught her, even if honesty had never once made her life easier. The confession hung between them in the parking garage's fluorescent lighting, more intimate and raw than Soo-jin had intended. She expected judgment, maybe disgust that she'd even considered theft. Instead, Do-hyun's expression softened into something resembling respect. He told her that her honesty, including the admission of temptation, was more valuable than the ring itself. Anyone could return a found object out of fear of consequences. Choosing ethics while fully aware of what you're sacrificing, that was character. He offered the reward on the spot, pulling out his phone to arrange an immediate transfer. Soo-jin named a figure that would cover her mother's remaining bills and her sister's tuition, far less than the posted reward amount. Do-hyun looked at her like she'd spoken a foreign language, then quietly tripled the sum before she could protest. He added his personal contact information, telling her to reach out if she ever needed anything. A job reference, professional advice, anything at all. The gesture felt genuine, absent the transactional calculation she'd expected from someone at his level. Soo-jin left that parking garage feeling lighter than she had in years, the money-solving problems that had crushed her for so long. She paid her debts, secured her sister's education, and even registered for the university entrance exam. Life didn't magically transform into a fairy tale, but the constant terror of financial collapse finally eased. She could breathe without calculating the cost of each breath. 3 months later, scandal exploded across Seoul's business news. Do-hyun's engagement to Yoon Mi-rae had imploded spectacularly, the merger deal collapsed, and rumors swirled about the reasons behind the split. Some whispered about infidelity, others suggested the Yoon family had discovered financial irregularities. The truth, as Soo-jin eventually learned, was simpler and more devastating. The ring she'd returned had become a symbol of everything wrong with Do-hyun's arranged life. His mother's ring represented authentic love, a marriage built on genuine connection rather than strategic alliance. Holding it again after nearly losing it had forced Do-hyun to confront how far he'd strayed from his parents' values, how completely he'd let his family's expectations override his own desires. Mi-rae was beautiful, intelligent, perfectly suitable, and he felt absolutely nothing for her beyond professional respect. The engagement was a business arrangement dressed in romantic trappings, and he couldn't force himself to honor it anymore. The fallout was catastrophic. His family threatened disinheritance. The Yoon family's retaliation affected multiple business deals. Do-hyun's position at Choi Industries became precarious, board members questioning his judgment and stability. Seoul's elite society that had once courted him now whispered about his betrayal, his selfishness, his dramatic rejection of a woman who'd done nothing wrong except agree to a loveless arrangement. Soo-jin learned about the scandal from news reports, feeling a strange connection to events in a world that should have remained separate from hers. She wondered if her act of returning the ring had somehow catalyzed Do-hyun's decision, if her simple honesty had reminded him what authentic choices looked like. The thought was presumptuous, probably narcissistic. She was just a cleaning woman who'd returned a lost object. She couldn't possibly have influenced a CEO's major life decisions. Then Do-hyun showed up at her university, 6 months after their parking garage encounter. Soo-jin had just finished her entrance exam, exhausted and cautiously optimistic about her performance, when she found him waiting outside the testing center. He looked different, less polished, more human, the carefully constructed facade of corporate perfection eroded by months of public scrutiny and private turmoil. He asked if she'd have coffee with him, phrasing it as a request rather than the command someone of his status could have issued. Soo-jin agreed out of curiosity and a strange sense that refusing would be cruel. They ended up at a modest cafe near campus, the kind of place where students studied late into the night, fueled by cheap coffee and cheaper snacks. Do-hyun looked completely out of place, and somehow more comfortable than she'd ever seen him in his corporate environment. He explained that breaking his engagement had cost him almost everything: his family's approval, his position at the company, most of his social connections. But it had also freed him in ways he hadn't experienced since childhood. He'd started his own venture, something smaller and more meaningful than empire building. He was rebuilding his life according to his own values, rather than inherited expectations. And he wanted to thank Soo-jin, because her honesty had been the catalyst that made him question everything. The conversation stretched for hours, coffee growing cold as they talked about their vastly different experiences of the same city, the same systems that elevated some while crushing others. Do-hyun admitted he'd been thinking about her constantly since their encounter, not in any romantic sense initially, but as a reminder that integrity still existed in a world that seemed designed to reward its opposite. She represented something he'd lost somewhere in his climb to the top, the ability to make choices based on principle rather than calculation. Soo-jin found herself drawn to this version of Do-hyun, stripped of corporate armor and status markers. He listened when she talked about her struggles with genuine interest rather than patronizing sympathy. He asked questions that showed he understood that poverty wasn't a character flaw, but a systemic trap that hard work alone couldn't escape. He seemed, for lack of a better word, real in ways she hadn't expected from someone born into his level of privilege. Their friendship developed gradually over the following months. Defying every social boundary Seoul's rigid class system insisted should remain impermeable. Do-hyun attended Soo-jin's university orientation, celebrating her achievement like it mattered as much as any corporate merger. Soo-jin helped him navigate the practical realities of his reduced circumstances, teaching him skills that wealth had previously allowed him to outsource. They existed in a strange liminal space, both transitioning between worlds, both learning to rebuild identities that didn't depend on their previous definitions of success. The shift from friendship to something deeper happened so gradually that neither could identify the precise moment feelings changed. Maybe it was when Do-hyun showed up during Soo-jin's late-night study session with food and encouraging words. Maybe it was when Soo-jin instinctively called Do-hyun first, after receiving news that her university entrance scores had qualified her for full scholarship. Maybe it was the accumulation of small moments when they stopped thinking about what made them different and started recognizing what made them the same. Two people trying to live authentically in a world that punished authenticity at every turn. Do-hyun's family's reaction to their relationship was predictably horrific. They'd barely forgiven him for destroying the Yoon alliance. Dating a former cleaning woman represented the ultimate humiliation, proof that he'd completely lost his mind and any sense of propriety. His father delivered an ultimatum: end the relationship, or face complete estrangement, financial and otherwise. Do-hyun chose Soo-jin without hesitation, a choice that terrified her almost as much as it moved her. She tried to break things off, unable to bear the weight of destroying his family connections. The guilt of potentially ruining his life felt crushing, reminiscent of every other time her mere existence had been positioned as a burden to others. Do-hyun refused to accept her sacrifice, arguing that she'd taught him the most important lesson of his life, that integrity meant making hard choices when easy alternatives existed. If he abandoned her now to preserve relationships built on conditional love and social calculation, he'd prove he'd learned nothing. Seoul's gossip mills had a field day with their relationship. The headlines were cruel and predictable: gold digger tropes, speculation about manipulation, amateur psychology about Do-hyun's supposed rebellion against his family. Soo-jin endured public scrutiny she'd never asked for, her life dissected by strangers who knew nothing about her beyond prejudices about class and poverty. Some days, the pressure felt unbearable, and she questioned whether love could possibly be worth this constant assault. But slowly, unexpectedly, public opinion began shifting. Their story resonated with Seoul's younger generation, fed up with arranged marriages and status obsessions. Social media erupted with support, people sharing their own experiences of choosing love over convenience, of defying family expectations to pursue authentic happiness. The narrative transformed from scandal to something approaching inspiration, proof that Seoul's rigid hierarchies weren't as immutable as they seemed. Do-hyun's startup succeeded beyond anyone's predictions, built on values that prioritized employee welfare and sustainable growth over quarterly profits and shareholder demands. Soo-jin graduated top of her class, her thesis on economic inequality and social mobility earning recognition beyond the university's walls. They built lives that honored both their backgrounds, his privilege teaching him what needed changing, her struggles teaching her what genuinely mattered. The proposal happened simply, without the elaborate productions that wealth typically demanded. Do-hyun brought Soo-jin back to the exact spot where she'd found his mother's ring 3 years earlier, that same stretch of Gangnam pavement now familiar and transformed by memory. He knelt in the street during evening rush hour, traffic moving around them like water around stones, and offered her the ring that had started everything. He explained that the ring had been meant for his mother by a father who'd married for love, despite his family's objections. It represented the kind of partnership built on choice rather than arrangement, on mutual respect rather than strategic alliance. Do-hyun wanted Soo-jin to wear it not because of its monetary value, but because she embodied everything it symbolized: courage, integrity, the willingness to choose difficult right over easy wrong. Soo-jin said yes with tears streaming down her face, not caring about the strangers stopping to watch, about the phones recording their moment, about anything beyond this person who'd seen her invisible existence and decided it mattered. The ring slipped onto her finger like it had been designed specifically for her hand, which maybe, in some cosmic sense, it had been. Their wedding was modest by Seoul's elite standards, but lavish by Soo-jin's previous expectations, a blend of worlds that represented what they'd built together. Do-hyun's mother attended, his father conspicuously absent, but no longer actively hostile. Soo-jin's sister served as maid of honor, already attending university on her own merit, freed from the financial pressures that had nearly crushed her education. The ceremony honored both families' traditions, while creating space for new possibilities. Years later, when people asked Soo-jin about the turning point in her life, she'd hold up her hand and let light catch the diamonds in her mother-in-law's ring. She'd explain that she'd found it in a puddle during Seoul's rainy season, that one honest choice had cascaded into transformation she'd never imagined possible. But the real story was more complex than fairy tale narratives suggested. The ring hadn't magically solved problems or erased struggles. What it had done was reveal that systems aren't as fixed as they appear, that individual choices accumulate into larger changes, that sometimes choosing integrity over survival instinct plants seeds that grow in unexpected directions. Soo-jin had returned a lost ring because that's what decent people did. Everything else, the romance, the social mobility, the small rebellions against rigid hierarchies, those were consequences of maintaining character when circumstances made character costly. Do-hyun built his success on principles Soo-jin had demonstrated through simple action, that honesty shouldn't require wealth as prerequisite, that doing right shouldn't demand more from poor people than rich ones, that integrity was valuable precisely because it cost something. Together, they created a life that honored where they'd each come from while refusing to be limited by those origins. The ring still sat on Soo-jin's finger decades later, its platinum band worn smooth by years of life fully lived. It had been lost, found, lost again in a different sense, and finally found its permanent home. Just like the two people it connected, both lost in their own ways, both finding in each other the home that society's rigid structures had nearly denied them. Seoul's rain still fell on Gangnam's streets, puddles still reflected streetlight, and somewhere out there other people faced choices between convenience and character. Soo-jin hoped they'd choose character, even when it cost them. Especially when it cost them. Because sometimes the things we find by being honest are infinitely more valuable than what we lose by refusing to be.